climate change is the way the Earth functions, the way the interaction between the land and the sea and the atmosphere. And it's the Earth's 4.5 billion years old, you know, and it's quite amazing how we have this blue planet. Like, how did it all happen, you know? And how, what is the chances of it happening, you know? And really, when you think about the odds of what's happened, the Earth is in what's called the Goldilocks zone. So like it's not too far away, so the water's frozen, and it's not too close, it's all boiled away. The fact we have water, we were lucky in the early formation of the Earth to be bombarded from the outer solar system with all these asteroids which had carried water with them, which are being created in some other function in the universe. So we bought all this water. But now, then we had the water, we were lucky to have an iron core. So the Earth turns or spins and creates a magnetic field. So if you've ever seen the Northern Lights, for all those of you that have been lucky enough, and it's the Southern Lights, what that is the coronal mass ejection, charged particles from the sun streaming out, which have stripped away the atmosphere of Mars, leaving it devoid of anything. And because we have this magnetic field, it protects us. And without that, there would not be life. And then we were lucky that life came, we don't even know, and it was started in the sea, and it generated all this oxygen through photosynthesis. And all of a sudden, we've got too much oxygen in the atmosphere, and a lot of it coagulated into O3, ozone. And lo and behold, it's that ozone that protects us from the high frequency radiation, the gamma rays, the X-rays from the sun, which allowed life to get out of the sea and to come onto the land. And above all, if we're talking about lucky, there's Godfather Jupiter. And Jupiter has saved this Earth on over now billions of years. If there's an asteroid belt, and Jupiter controls the whole thing and keeps all those asteroids and meteors in control. Ones that come from outer space, there are a couple that came in in 2003, and they filmed them crashing into Jupiter. It protects us from being blasted out of the whole solar system from these disastrous events that could happen. But there have been a few that got away, and one of them was 150 million years ago, and it hit the Earth, and that's why the dinosaurs became extinct. And there's a classic example of climate change. So the climate change is controlled, is a subject of or dependent on the relationship between land, sea, and the air. But to cut a long story short, it's like a blanket. If we didn't have greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the surface temperature of the Earth would be an average of minus 19 degrees centigrade. But because we've got greenhouse gases, it holds the heat in. And, you know, for many hundreds of thousands of years, there's been a sort of consistent level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And over recent millennia, we've had the Earth at a surface temperature average of 15 degrees. But very quickly, in the last 200 years or so, it's increased and is now up by 1.1 degrees from that average, because the greenhouse gas blanket is getting thicker. And this is what the greenhouse gas effect is. So the enhanced greenhouse effect is the term that they've labeled for what we've done as a human species in putting extra greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So very quickly, the main greenhouse gas by volume is water vapor, and ozone also acts as a greenhouse gas. But the ones that we have control over are carbon dioxide, which is the preeminent gas. But now we've got methane, there's nitrous oxide, and then there's the human-made gases, which have become prevalent since the end of the Second World War. And these gases all have the ability to trap heat. And so for millennia, there was this cycle, the carbon goes in photosynthesis, take the trees and the plants and take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The biggest lungs of the earth are the oceans. In actual, there's two ways the oceans take up carbon dioxide. In the colder waters, and also through photosynthesis in the algae, etc. And there is emission of carbon dioxide from the hotter waters, etc. But there's been this sort of dynamic cycle, and then along came us, and we started digging up the fossil fuels, which, they're very energy intense. So it was a no-brainer in a sense that we can use this fuel, which, by the way, comes from trees that grew years ago in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. I'm talking about billions of years ago, before the evolution of a bacteria that could, or microbes that could break down the timber. So it sort of got locked away and felt the trees eventually died, and then it was covered up by earthquakes and volcanoes, and over time turned into coal and oil and gas, the fossil fuels as we know now. So what we've done is tip the balance in terms of those gases. And when they burn, the main emission in terms of greenhouse gases, there's a lot of other nasty ones too. Let's not talk about arsenic and things like that. But the greenhouse gas component is mostly carbon dioxide, but then there's methane and nitrous oxide. So those three gases automatically emitted when you combust fossil fuels. And unfortunately, the methane gas is, in terms of being a greenhouse gas, it's really much better than carbon dioxide. In fact, it's 28 times better than carbon dioxide. And nitrous oxide is 310, whoops, they've changed the thing, 298 times better at being a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So we're putting these gases up, and then along come the human-made gases, mainly fluorinated gases, and they are just like, we're putting gases up in that atmosphere, are going to be up there for thousands of years, and we've thrown the balance out. We've now increased the blanket, and one last point on it is that whilst we can do our carbon offsetting and we can sequestrate carbon dioxide, we can take it back out of the atmosphere, it's very difficult to take methane, nitrous oxide, and these human-made gases back out again. If we go back to the luck of what the way the earth is, and if we go back to a couple of other little minor factors, like where else can we go? If we don't preserve what we've got, where else can we go? At the moment, a speed of light, 300,000 kilometers per second, we have to overcome that. And even at that speed, the closest sun to it, the solar system to us, is 4 light years away, traveling at 300,000 kilometers per second for 4 years before you get there. We need to, and we even have to find somewhere else we could go. And of course, the third part to that is, well, why do we spoil what we've got? And if we keep what's happening is that by the blanket getting thicker, the system is gathering energy, heat energy. And it's like boiling water. If you start, you put that energy in there and that water starts to boil. And this is what's happening with the atmosphere. We're boiling it. We're starting to pump it up. And so when there's so much more energy, when we have storms, they're going to be bigger. They're going to be more powerful. And the interaction between the land, the sea, and the atmosphere is changing. It's even affecting the ocean currents. So, if you look at Venus, they're the ultimate example of runaway enhanced greenhouse effect. It is just 400 degrees centigrade on the surface of Venus. And if we keep going the way we're going, that's where we'll end up in the end, because the other issue is tipping points. Do well out of it. It doesn't mean that people have to go poor. We can actually rejig all of that as well. It's creating new industry, but from a different angle, and preserving the precious thing we have, the luck. There are predictions and studies that I've read recently. If it's 1.5 degrees, there'll be 50 days of hot days in some part of the world, and if it's 2 degrees, it'll be 65 days, and various comparisons about the difference. But I guess the answer to the question is people don't really know, except that when you're introducing more energy into the system, it's going to crank up. We're already seeing at 1.1 degrees the difference it's making. We saw the fires in Australia. There's multiple catastrophe at 1.1. If we get to 1.5, it's not going to be any better. It's going to be a lot worse. If we go to 2 degrees, we're now going to go. The problem is this: if we get to these tipping points, if we get to stages where it's irreversible, one of the chief ones is the permafrost, release of methane from the permafrost in the Arctic. There's a number of ones about irreversible, the loss of the Amazon rainforest itself. We're getting, so if it keeps getting hot enough, you'll get to a point where these natural systems can't restore themselves at all. And this is the problem. So yes, I could do a thesis on the difference between the two, but the hotter the Earth gets, the closer we get to a point where we can't stop
it. What is the meaning of climate mitigation, and what is the meaning of climate adaptation?
Climate mitigation's where you try to do things to prevent the emissions of greenhouse gases. Adaptations is adapting to after you've done that and the impacts of it. That's really the difference between the two. So in terms of the mitigation side of things, it's a matter of how can we reduce the amount of our carbon emissions. And if I go back to COP26, Committee of the Parties 26, that you were just held, that currently the human species is responsible for the emission of 50 gigatons of greenhouse gases per annum. If we want to hold it back at 1.5 degrees, we need to halve that. Currently under the pledges at 2.1 degrees, there will be heating to 2.1 degrees under the current pledges if they are enacted. So that's a whole issue. But the long and short of it all is if we want to be effective in our mitigation, we have to cease the use of fossil fuels ASAP. It's as simple as that, because there's no way in the world. We've now, of course, there's all those other greenhouse gases I mentioned. There's the methane, the nitrous oxide. We need to look at we're using artificial fertilizers and the nitrous oxide at 298 times global warming potential. Let's go back to our organic fertilizers. The methane thing, we've got to look at ways that there's less from the animals, less emissions, less landfill emissions. Fugitive emissions from coal mines represent probably about a third of the methane emissions. This is mitigation. We need to cease that, stop, finish, over, done. It's as simple as that. The maths is simple. 50 gigatons we're putting up there. We need to reduce that to 25 gigatons. That's the mitigation we need to do. In terms of the adaptation, is a whole new story. And here we have the developed countries or the rich countries, and we've got the developing countries that, you're saying, well, you people, you put it up there, you did it, so why we need a chance too. So, and finance, so it's fair. And where are you people? Thing that they're putting up, rich countries are putting $100 billion and they've received pledges up to 96 billion or whatever. But it's yet to be seen where that money goes, because the rich countries, in terms of adaptation, are sort of less inclined to give money towards adaptation, towards a disaster that's already been, right, and more to give the money to, a solar farm, because then they can see, oh, look, there's return on investment, and oh, we did this. You can see that. But I suppose if you give the money to help people that are struggling after a huge storm or drought, it's not so evident the results. So the adaptation thing has its own complexity too, that in terms of how do we look after people properly that have been affected by the actions of our countries over the time. The name of the company is based on the fact that you can make more money for your business if you're also trying, in a sense, making it more profitable for the ecology. So, we're seeing it now with renewable energy, that it's, it's cheaper. It's cheaper than using coal-fired power, like it was always the case. It was, and that's, so what we do at EcoProfit is to show people how they can, in their business, they can actually invest in renewable energy or energy efficiency and get a return on their investment. And now that's becoming, we've developed a thing called the ROI curve, return on investment carbon curve. And what it is on the vertical axis, in a sense, is the internal rate of return on a project. So do I upgrade the lights? Do I go to EV fleet? Do I do variable speed drive? Do I go to renewable energy? What's the return on investment if I go down those paths? And then ranked on the horizontal axis about how many tons of CO2 am I going to save if I do that? Because let's not forget, everyone's talking about net zero, and net zero means calculating a carbon footprint, and that's a whole new regime. And then the second and most important part before you get to the offsetting is to reduce your carbon emissions, to minimize them as much as you can. So this is what we do, is to help advise clients that there's your options. This is a return on investment. This is how many tons of CO2 you're going to save. And we also do a lot of education too along this line, and in various courses we run, and we sell carbon offsets for the last part of the net zero equation of offsetting your emissions. The Sunshine Project for Community Inc. is our charity. And the reason we created that was, with carbon offsetting, so you pay money to help set up roof solar on a village on the other part of the world, somewhere a long way away, where you have no personal involvement. Yet in our own community here in Australia, I used to be the New South Wales operations manager for Secondbot. I've seen how many people do it tough. A lot of people do it tough. So there's a lot of organisations out there that are trying to have emergency food, taking care of loneliness, programs to help people to get out of whatever bind they may be in. These are the people that are doing this as a charity themselves, that need as much money as they can to devote to their core missions, you know? So what we do is when we sell an offset, we take $1 from every offset we sell and put it into our charity, Sunshine Project, which is devoted to funding solar, battery, etc. Carbon offset is something that's some people have looked at as an indulgence from the old days in the Catholic religion, where you pay for your sins, and in a sense, there has been many cases where that's been the case. Nevertheless, a well-constructed carbon offset is the only thing we have left. If you look at net zero, it has three components. It has the carbon footprint side. Then the next part, the most important part, which I don't know how many people understand just yet, is to reduce your carbon emissions as much as you can. And then whatever's left over, you have to offset. In other words, find something that either you grew some trees and you sequestered the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, or more controversially, you got some money and you paid to the landowners not to cut down the forest. Let's not forget that 747 square kilometres of forest is being cut down every day. Or you got some money, and so people were going to have coal-fired powered electricity, and you said, oh, wait a minute, I've got some money, I'll do a hydro system for you, or I'll do a solar system for you, so that you don't use that electricity. So it's avoiding that carbon emission. So there's that three components, and it's whether the way that those various carbon offset programs are conducted, the methodologies that are used underneath, whether they're properly enforced, is the question of the quality of the carbon offset. But, what is good out of the COP26 is that from the original Paris Agreement at Article 6, it was talking about the carbon markets essentially, and the rules, and avoiding double counting and things like that. There are a lot of steps now being made since that just 2 weeks ago, and hoping to see, and I will also say that there's a voluntary carbon offset market, and there's standards out there like Vera and Gold Standard that have done quite a very sound job without making their own regulations to make sure these offsets are fair income. There's also the clean energy regulator that I'll mention here, that whilst there's issues with the development of programs and things like that, has now gained itself as an excellent reputation around the world as something that's fair income. But then if we look at carbon offsets in the view of the net zero, one of the problems is we've got everyone saying, we're going to be net zero. We're going to, yay, man. Well, there's a few problems, and the problems are that within the calculation of the carbon footprint, if you apply the strict letter of the law through the GHG protocol, there's a lot more carbon emissions that aren't being calculated in companies' carbon footprints at the moment, which, as in my prediction, is with natural disasters, as they increase, it's getting more sort of emphasis on did you really take up all your carbon emissions like you should have? That's one thing. So the carbon footprint thing is going to expand. But the other side is that down at the cost of the offsets, there just aren't enough offset programs. So enough offsets being created. Demand and supply, we've seen it with the ACCUs, the Clean Energy Regulator, now over $40, over more than doubled in sort of two to 3 months. We're going to see this spike in carbon offsets. So on one side, you've got the pressure of going net zero, and then somebody calling you to account as your business. Your business is, wait a minute, mate, you haven't included that. You haven't included the embedded emissions in the purchase, in the goods you bought. You've got to put that into, what? And then you've got the cost of the offsets going up. So what I'm talking about here is corporate risk, climate risk, call it what you want. There needs to be companies need to start looking at this very closely, and the impacts on inflation as well, because at the end users will pay. So we're in a very interesting period of time. And as I say, I think it's all going to be related back to the amount of natural disasters and the dramas that fall out from that, as to how more quickly we need to adapt to a new environment. We are in a new Scope 1 emissions, basically the emissions under your roof, your warehouse, your factory, your house, whatever. And mostly fossil fuels are the main ones. Energy use, whether it be driving your car, gas, using gas, that sort of thing. There are other ones like refrigerant leakage, which, yes, it's smaller, but very damaging. As I say, those gases up there for thousands of years. But essentially, it's the fossil fuels you burn under your roof. Scope 2 is the emissions of electricity generation, which is a good news story in the case of Australia and Europe too. In particular, we're seeing the emissions rates drop as more renewable energy comes into the system, not through any federal government policy in Australia, let me say, but through other things. We had the renewable energy target and a number of other things, and we had the carbon pricing mechanism. Was the best system was ever developed, as far as I can see, in terms of emission trading schemes, which is a pity that was Tony Abbott had that pulled with his mate Greg. Yes, so what was emissions? Emissions 2 is electricity, and the emissions. It's a good news story. The emissions have dropped with electricity, but yes, it's to do with all the electricity you use in your business or at home or things like that. Scope 3 emissions are all the other emissions, whether they be what's called upstream or what's called downstream. So if you're the example I use in my classes, if you're making croissants, then if you look to the upstream, then there's the emissions of the farmer that grew the wheat, and then there was the byproducts that went into it. There was the going to the flour mill, there was the packaging, there was the transportation at every step of the way, which we can now calculate by life cycle analysis. And then downstream from we make the croissants, and then downstream is all the carbon emissions of the people we sold to, and they had to drive to the shop, and the packaging and the waste they had and all that sort of stuff. So Scope 3 includes the whole value chain, and this is where I was touched on before. If you read the GHG protocol Scope 3 value chain and the strict rules, and which have been brought into the official Australian carbon neutral program, Climate Active, on sort of mostly been adapted. But if you read those rules strictly and you took up the minimum boundaries, the minimum emissions you should be including, it's quite scary to read. Because if you have an obligation to offset those emissions and you've done nothing about trying to reduce them, then you're going to be in, all of a sudden, you're going to be in a bad place, because if the carbon offset prices are going up, and they're also turning around, I'm repeating myself here, but they're insisting that you extend your carbon footprint to include these scope 3 emissions, which in short should be included in your carbon footprint if they are deemed to be relevant. And those terms of deemed to be relevant are quite subjective at the moment, but as over time, they will become closer and closer and closer and more clearly defined. So we're a retail aggregator, so that we can buy on behalf of clients and surrender those offsets for them, because the key to offsets is that you can't keep selling them. You know, I bought it and then I claim it and then sell it on, so that they have to be surrendered. It's a key function of the whole thing. We also are very careful to make sure the type of offset we buy, and you know, the whole thing. It also, adding on to every offset that we buy on behalf of clients, $1 goes to our charity. I'm also aware that a lot of people aren't really au fait with this, you know, going carbon neutral, net zero, and all this sort of stuff. And what does it mean? And you know, I try to ease people into it. And you know, in a sense, I think Climate Active too, the official program, are trying to do that. They're sort of suggesting that, look, we don't expect you to take up all your, certainly take up all your scope 1 and 2 emissions in terms of fossil fuel combustion. But as far as scope 3 is concerned, we'll give you a bit of time. We'll give you, you know, time to talk to your supply chain and get them, you know, your suppliers, to then look at being carbon neutral. So encourage that as well. And we do the same thing. I apply similar rules because they do come from the GHG protocol. So it's just to get people into the swing of it and realize that this is something that it's a responsible thing to do. It helps the environment. It helps you know, and their own carbon management programs as well. We find that as we do some of these exploration in the carbon footprints, we find inefficiencies in other ways, whether it's water use or just time, employee time, and things like that we can improve on. But above all, what's amazing, what I've found, is that when you're a company that's actually doing things, and when you're looking, right, we're going to have this strategic strategy, we're going to reduce our risk, we're going to look at investments where we can reduce our carbon emissions, we're going to offset our emissions, we care. And if at the same time you're reaching out at a social level and everything else, your staff actually go, hey, wait a minute, these guys are fair econ, you know what I mean? So it's their morale lifts. It's EcoProfit, you know, there's total benefits to helping the environment and helping your business make more money in terms of expenses. But once you have your staff being more motivated, the revenue stream at the top, where the money comes in, goes. If we just go back to the bare bones of net zero, and the carbon neutral's in there, so there's these two expressions, and some people say that carbon neutral means that you add up all your emissions and then you buy an equivalent number of offsets. Like all your emissions, carbon emissions, are measured in tons, all based on carbon dioxide being the measure, and then like methane, right? So there was a ton of methane from the landfill. Or they figured it out that methane is 28 times better than carbon dioxide of being a greenhouse gas. So they say, well, that ton is equal to 28 tons of CO2e, and the E stands for equivalent. So nitrous oxide, 298 times. So they've calculated all this. You calculate the carbon footprint, blending all the different gases that there were, the refrigerant leakage from your fridge, from the air conditioner, 5,000 times better than carbon dioxide. Anyway, you add it all up, and then you go, what can I do? And this is the most important part. What can I do to get the emissions down? And that's where we fit in. say, well, we're not just going to lose money for losing money doing this just to be nice. What is the return on investment if we take certain options to do that? What is it going to cost? What's my capital, upfront capital? And then how much money, how long before I get my money back, mate? You know what I mean? So, and then I get to residual emissions. There's nothing I can do about it. Those are the ones where we have to buy the offsets, which is the equivalent to a ton of carbon dioxide sequestered or avoided really. So we avoided putting that methane up from the atmosphere. We avoided putting the nitrous oxide up into the atmosphere, So some sort of program like that would have happened. It's called additionality. It would have happened, but because this carbon offset program funded an alternative, it didn't happen. So yes, that's the structure of net zero. But as I say, just going back on what I said before, that there's only a certain amount of offsets at the moment. So we're already seeing the prices rising. So the more people, the more countries, the more companies, the more people that say they want to be net zero, the more there's going to be this demand for offsets and the higher the price is going to go. So I've actually, in my ROIC curve, this is the curve I mentioned before in the internal rate of return. Let's just say I'm going to do a light upgrade, I've now including where pertinent the cost of the offsets that I don't have to buy. The cost of the offset. So in case of if I'm upgrading LED lighting at scope 2. So let's just say in the short term that there will be, you've got to offset your scope 1 and 2 emissions at least before you talk about scope 3. Well, there we're talking about scope 2, reducing the amount of electricity we use. We went from fluorescent batten, for instance, to an LED battens, and we've got 500 of them. And it's going to cost us 100 Gs, whatever. We put that plug that in, and then we go, righto, we're going to save X amount of kilowatt hours per year, which when we convert that in electricity savings is X amount. We're going to save X amount on maintenance because LEDs last so much longer. But now along comes another line. We are going to save 50 tons, 100 tons of carbon emissions, which we don't have to offset. And then I'll go blunk and I'll put in the number because of $40, because that's the latest accurate price. 40 times 100 tons. All of a sudden per annum, that is another additional saving in my operations. That's what I think every company should be thinking about, like the future is close.
Thank you. I think we are end of it. Just a second. Stop.